All right, you know what else is kind of a bummer about moving? Is losing access to your favorite spots around your neighborhood. Now, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm the weirdo in the room, but in every town or city that I've ever lived in, there have always been certain spots that have just meant something to me. Like this spot right here, this is where I proposed to my wife. Or this spot here, that's where me and my friends used to play knockout for hours. Or this trail I would walk along when I just kind of needed time to think. And maybe you have a few spots like that of your own, right? Like that park bench across town, or that one big flat rock by the creek, or the cool little alleyway behind the convenience store. If you've been able to live in one place for longer than a few years, then chances are you found a few cool little spots that mean more to you than they would to anyone else. When you move away, you have to say goodbye to those spots. And that can be really hard, because if your spots are anything like mine, there is a certain level of intimacy with those spots, right? The moments that you've experienced in those spots have mattered to you. They really meant something. That park bench across town, that's where you always felt at peace when everything in your life was falling apart. That flat rock by the creek is where you went every day after school to unwind. That alleyway behind the convenience store is where you finally mastered parkour. All right, fine, you really just managed to jump over a trash can lid one time, but it was still cool. It was cool. And moving to another place means you won't get to visit those spots nearly as often. Last week we opened up this series by talking about how the Israelites in the Old Testament knew what it was like to not be able to go to a certain spot, particularly a certain meaningful spot, very frequently. The Holy of Holies, hidden behind the curtain of the tabernacle, was the most meaningful spot on earth because it was where God chose to be present with his people in a tangible way. He chose to dwell inside of a box, right? And they called that box the Ark of the Covenant, which was kept in the Holy of Holies. But just like how you and I are unable to visit our meaningful spots after we move, the Israelites were unable to visit this particularly meaningful spot because of their sin. In the Old Covenant, the unrighteousness of God's people demanded a cap to the depth and frequency of his presence in their lives. There was a cap to the depth of his presence. They couldn't experience his full presence or they would die. There was a cap to the frequency of his presence, right? They could only experience his full presence once a year. And even then, it was only the one guy who could do that. Well, God had good reasons. He had good reasons for putting himself in that box. It did mean that God's people couldn't experience personal, intimate moments with him very often. We talked about this last week too, but a lot of us put God in our own box in a way, right? You might not carry around a little replica of the Ark of the Covenant and open it up to whisper into it whenever you want to pray, but we absolutely divide our lives up into little compartments and we try to make sure God stays in his. If you act differently at church than you do anywhere else, then you probably have God in a box. If you're really kind to your friends and acquaintances, but pretty short-tempered and mean to your family, you probably have God in a box. If spending time with God matters to you at camp, but doesn't matter to you at home, you probably have God in a box. We cap the depth of our relationship with God and the frequency of our experience of God when we keep him in the box. That's old covenant thinking. God in a box thinking is old covenant thinking. And as we're going to see today, something happened that changed the way God interacts with his people. And that something should have an absolutely enormous effect on the intimacy and frequency of our experience with God. We're in week 2 of seeing our personal relationship with God through the lens of the gospel. So let's jump in. In the short passage that we're about to read, Jesus is hanging on the cross, right? And so much is happening in this scene. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the gospel, Jesus' death on the cross served as payment for the sins of humanity. It was the ultimate declaration of God's love for the world. It's where the very worst thing happened to the very best person for the purpose of our redemption. And Jesus willingly went to the cross to die so that you and I could have a chance at spending eternal life with our Creator. So this is a big moment that we're about to witness, but in this big moment, there is a small detail that's mentioned that has huge implications for us and our God and our box. We're in Matthew 27, starting in verse 50. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. In other words, he died. And at that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And sometimes you read things in the Bible that feel like pretty normal. They feel like things that happen to all of us in everyday life. But other times you read things in the Bible and you have to acknowledge that that was a supernatural moment. It can't be explained by science, right? God chooses to make it happen in a way that defies science. This is one of those moments. And after Jesus took his last breath, the curtain separating the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, from the rest of the temple spontaneously tore in half. That doesn't just happen on its own. That's supernatural. And the question that we have to ask is, why? Why did God tear that curtain in two? And we know from last week that God was the one who originally gave the order for that curtain to be set up in front of the Holy of Holies. We know from last week that God set up that curtain for the safety of his people. We know from last week that God's holiness is like electricity and our sinfulness is like water, and that any human being who encounters God's presence instantly dies because water plus electricity equals death for whatever else is in the way. So what changed? What changed that God would suddenly send the message that everyone is invited to his presence? Had humanity suddenly become perfect and sinless?
Yeah, considering humanity had just murdered the Son of God, probably not.
Did God change his nature and cease to be completely holy and perfect?
Nope.
And the only thing that changed is that Jesus died on the cross. And when he did, he took on our unrighteousness and placed his righteousness on us. He took on our imperfection and placed his perfection on us. He took our sin and placed his holiness on us. God put himself in a box because our sinfulness demanded separation, but Jesus made a way for all who believe in him to be holy in God's sight. When God supernaturally tore that curtain in half at the moment that Jesus died, he was very clearly trying to communicate that things were changing. Jesus' death on the cross ushered in a new era of relating to God, and curtains and boxes were no longer invited to the party. And despite the fact that none of us lived during the Old Covenant, and despite the fact that humanity hasn't been under the Old Covenant for over 2,000 years, a lot of us are still clutching on to the box. It's like it's been ingrained in our spiritual DNA to put God in a box. I just want you to know that I get that. I want you to know that you're not crazy, that to some degree, it makes sense that you love the box. I mean, God was the one who put himself in the box in the first place. But you need to acknowledge in this moment that God never intended to operate from a box forever. It was always his intention to break down the curtain separating himself from humanity and to allow his people to experience him intimately and frequently. And he did it through the death of his son, Jesus. When Jesus died, he died holding a box cutter. So if you want to experience the kind of full, deep, meaningful relationship with God that you wish you could have, you need to let Jesus take a box cutter to your God box. Here's the point. You need to let go of the box. You have to. You need to stop compartmentalizing. You need to stop only including God when it's convenient. You need to stop watching everyone else experience God, and you need to experience him for yourself. And I think if you'll just let go of the box and let Jesus take a box cutter to your compartmentalized, capped, limited relationship with God, I think that what you'll find is that what you're left with is more real, more freeing, and more helpful in your everyday life. We'll see you later.